Grey minion is considered an emblematic ceramic class of Middle Bronze Age in mainland Greece. It is a ceramic tradition particularly related to central Greece, mainly Boeotia, where it was first recognized by Heinrich Schliemann during the Orchomenos excavations back to 19th century and named after the mythical king of Minias. Because of the radical changes that took place in the material record towards the end of the early Bronze Age, which are traditionally described in terms of backwardness, Grey minion was not simply considered as a new ceramic trend, but it was the product of a new population that had just arrived, the first ancestors of Greeks, according to the old-fashioned culture-historical approach. Although the Middle Helladic material excavated at Orchomenos had to wait for a century to be fully published, the characteristics of Grey minion, as first described in some detail by Forsdyke, namely the use of fine clay pastes, the grey color throughout section due to reducing firing, the nicely burnished surfaces with a so-called soapy texture, and the systematic use of potter's wheel became archetypical. Consequently, any variation observed that could not fit into the above criteria, especially in terms of the potter's wheel, was usually considered to represent an inferior product, an imitation of the true Grey minion. Modern research, though, emphasizes regionalism as a significant component of the Middle Helladic period, with variability being particularly expressed in ceramics. Therefore, any distinction made between an exemplary feature and a less carelessly made replica may be actually arbitrary and pointless. Common cultural traits did exist, and the production of burnished ceramics in reducing atmosphere was one of them, shared by many sub-regions of the Greek mainland. However, this was not necessarily a one-way routine. The main subject of this presentation is to underline the differences existed in the potting traditions linked to the production of Grey minion, which will be hereafter preferably called as Grey burnished, between two regions belonging to different cultural spheres, namely Argolid and Attica. The cultural divergence is particularly strengthened by the differences observed in the shape repertoire of the Grey burnished of each area. This, combined with the differentiated use of wheel, provoke the traditionally established and very simplistic idea of imitating models of production. Compared to other areas of mainland Greece, the Middle Helladic period of the Argolid in northeastern Peloponnese is much better explored as a consequence of the early attention attracted by the later prosperous Mycenaean civilization that emerged in sites which were already and uninterruptedly inhabited from the beginning of Middle Helladic period. The most significant Middle Helladic settlements developed around the Argive plain, which remained of nodal point for the entire Bronze Age. Except of Assini, though, the other major centers, with stratified evidence of continuous habitation, such as Argos and Lerna, are still largely unpublished, while others, which later developed into major palatial centers, including Mycenae, Tiryns, and Midea, preserve poor evidence of the Middle Helladic period, mostly because of later disturbances, especially of intense building activity. For the needs of this presentation, I will particularly focus on Argos, where I had the opportunity to examine unpublished material from stratified deposits for my PhD. During Middle Helladic I-II, habitation in Argos was dispersed, organized in different nuclei, on top of Aspis, Larissa, in the ravine of the Iras at the southeastern foothills of Aspis, as well as in the south quarter of the modern city. During Middle Helladic III to Late Helladic I, the settlement plan changed drastically. Except of Aspis, all other habitation districts were abandoned and population was now concentrated at the southeastern foothills of Aspis, which also went through major reorganization. The material discussed here is dated to Middle Helladic I to Middle Helladic III early and derives from settlement and stratified contexts, mainly from the south quarter and secondarily from the Iras. The Grey burnished from the context examined is grouped in three subclasses according to fabric: fine grey, semi-fine grainy, and semi-fine with black inclusions. Fine grey predominates, and semi-fine grainy is also common, although fluctuations in the relative percentages between subphases existed. Semi-fine with black inclusions is less popular throughout the period studied. Similar shapes are attested in all three varieties. In terms of the manufacturing process, Grey burnished of Argos is strictly related to handmade techniques. The wheel, if not a simple turntable, might have only been used sporadically for the finishing of rims and possibly the decoration of shoulders, with even parallel incisions and grooves. Evidence for the use of wheel in a more complex way, namely from an earlier stage of the construction process, including the joining of coils, was only observed in a restricted number of pots, mostly related to shapes closely linked to potting traditions of central Greece, including Attica, with the two-handled bowls with angular body, ring base and dropped shape rim being the prevailing shape. These are mainly found in Middle Helladic I late to Middle Helladic II deposits. The fabric of the specific vases is always fine, but usually of dark grey color, with well-burnished but less shiny surfaces compared to the handmade fine grey burnished pots. The petrographic examination, combined with refining test of small chips, indicated the use of slightly different fine clay pastes, which are more grainy and less calcareous compared to the fine clays used for the handmade grey burnished. Given the fine texture of the fabric, a local provenance cannot be excluded. In this case, they do not simply represent imitations, but they are associated to a deeply rooted know-how which is allied to local ceramic traditions. In other words, if not imported, these are expected to be the products of possibly one or more potters initially trained in central Greece and later settled temporarily or permanently in the Argolid. In Aspis, the preliminary examination of the grey burnish suggested that it was equally handmade and wheel-fashioned, with the potter's wheel being incorporated into the manufacturing process in different ways, more or less complex, including the shaping of the rough out, the finishing of the rims and/or the upper parts of the containers, and the burnishing of the surfaces. More information for the typology and the chronological distribution of both handmade and well-fashioned grey burnished pots in Aspis will provide us with valuable insights into the coexistence or integration of foreign and local traditions, especially in late Middle Helladic period, as well as into the potential inequalities existed in the supply patterns of imported pottery between the different habitation areas of Argos. In Assini, the pioneer research conducted by Lindsay Spencer for pottery assemblances dated from early Helladic III to Middle Helladic II indicated that wheel-finished and wheel-fashioned products constitute diachronically a minority, with the latter being often produced in fabrics which are either non-local or of uncertain provenance. Although classification according to wear was not of primary importance, it is easy to assume that a significant amount of the wheel-fashioned pottery is related to grey burnished. Unfortunately, further details for particular shapes and specific typological features remain unknown. Middle Helladic period in Attica is the least explored compared to other prehistoric phases. Long-lived settlements presumably existed, like Athens and Eleusis. The stratigraphic evidence, though, is scarce because of continuous habitation in later periods and/or poor documentation of the excavation record of past decades. To give an outline of the available evidence, it is worth stressing the following. Early Helladic III to Middle Helladic I is only represented in an extremely limited number of sites by very few pottery, even fewer burials, and no architectural remains. Consequently, the end of early Helladic II and the transition of early to Middle Helladic period remains practically unknown. During Middle Helladic II to Middle Helladic III, the numbers of sites increased across Attica, although it never reached the density of settlements attested during the early Helladic period. This situation possibly reflects a more centralized model of habitation, which is also common for the Peloponnese. However, it is important to note that the majority of sites attributed to the specific period is only known through short reports or preliminary publications. Except for Eleusis, no other site has produced satisfactory evidence to reconstruct settlement organization. For Athens, it was recently suggested that habitation was organized in clusters around the Acropolis, but again, no architectural phases are distinguished. As far as the transitional late Middle Helladic to early late Helladic period is concerned, except of the exemplary publication of Joseph Maran for the related deposits excavated at Kiapha Thyti, the existing picture of the dearth of evidence from the rest of Attica does not change significantly. Even Anthorikos, which then became the most important center of Attica because of its control over the Lavrion mines, and as evidenced in the rich burial record of the site, settlement remains were not systematically explored and deposits were not always recorded in details. It is thus instantly clear that the Middle Helladic cultural changes, including the development of potting traditions, is difficult to track and organize within the traditional tripartite scheme. Inevitably then, The relative chronology of pottery and related finds is usually established based on parallels from stratified contexts in other areas. An intriguing feature of Attica is its geographical segmentation. A preliminary overview of the potting traditions in various Attic sites revealed interesting regional differences related mainly to external contacts, especially with Aegina and Chaos. As far as the Grey Bernist is concerned, it is in complete accordance with Central Greece's standards. However, a close study of the technology of its manufacture is certainly needed in order to shed light to potential differences in the potting traditions exercised, as well as the interregional contacts that might have developed. Here we will give a preliminary overview for the Grey Bernist from some major centers of the Middle Helladic period: Marathon, Athens, and Thorikos. The Marathon Plain is located on the northeastern coast of Attica, right at the entrance of the Euboean Gulf. Middle Helladic period is represented by both settlement and burial evidence. At the inland site of Vranas, a stone-coated tumulus, dated to Middle Helladic I and II, represents one of the earliest Middle Helladic monumental burial structures of the Greek mainland. The pottery found inside the graves, as well as in nearby deposits, consists of significant quantities of fine Grey Bernist ware. The close study of its technology, with special emphasis placed upon the intact vases from the graves, indicated that wheel-fashion technique was prevailing, with the wheel being introduced from an early stage of the manufacturing process. Only a few kilometers away at the nearby coastal site of Plassi, settlement remains were uncovered in late 60s, the systematic exploration of which started in 2015 by the University of Athens. The settlement remains includes, among others, an impressive fortification wall, a large rectangular building, the so-called Megaron of Plassi, dated to Middle Helladic II and III, and two contemporary pottery kilns. Other rectangular buildings, including a second smaller Megaron to the north, have also been unearthed. The excavations, though, of them and the study of the associated deposits has not been completed yet. Here we will focus on the deposits from the interior of the first Megaron, currently studied by the speaker. The Grey Bernist can be divided into three subclasses according to macroscopic fabric features: fine grey, semi-coarse with wheaties inclusions and silver mica, and semi-fine grainy. All varieties are represented with common shapes. Unfortunately, because of the later use of the area as burial ground during the transitional Middle Helladic III to Late Helladic I and many centuries afterwards during the Geometric period, in addition with the proximity of the Middle Helladic remains to modern ground level, significant disturbances have been caused and pottery has largely suffered from extreme fragmentation. Some observations, though, can be made. The fine grey variety is the dominant subgroup of Grey Bernist. Wheel has been commonly used for its production, and it seems that it was introduced from an early stage during the manufacturing process, possibly from joining the coins. This observation is mostly based on the uneven wall thickness, the fractures along sections, and the surface discontinuities observed, combined with the stretched surfaces and the typical striations created during rotation. Semi-coarse with wheaties inclusions and silver mica fabric group, which is the second most representative, has also produced similar evidence. However, there are few sherds with no evident wheel marks, suggesting that the potter's wheel might have not been systematically used for the manufacture of the specific subclass. Semi-fine grainy, on the other hand, which is less common, lacks entirely wheel marks. It becomes thus clear that both sides are set within the same prevailing technological framework as far as the Grey Bernist is concerned, as indicated by the predominance of fine fabrics, the systematic use of wheel fashion techniques, the creation of similar shapes intended to cover the same drinking habits, the burnish of the surfaces, and the firing in well-controlled reducing atmosphere. Variations, though, are not missing. Fine grey bernist of Plassi is always hard-fired, well-burnished, and exhibits darker grey hues compared to the fine variety of Vranas, the fabric of which is softer, light grey, and burnish seems more carelessly executed. Moreover, the semi-coarse and semi-fine varieties have not been recognized at Vranas. The petrographic examination and the chemical analysis conducted at Vranas do not exclude the local regional production of the grey bernist. The assumption is further reinforced by a few special typological features shared with other sites of Attica's east coast. Of course, the same analysis and Plassey are certainly obligatory and have been also scheduled for the immediate future in order to shed light to the provenance of Gray-Bernist. A working hypothesis for explaining the variability particularly seen at Plassey would be that the settlement, because of its privilege of being at the coast, was possibly subjected to more regional and external influences compared to the inland community of Ranas. At Athens, a Middle Helladic II deposit excavated at the Stoa Vasilios of the Athenian Agora was systematically examined and published. At the same area, an empty and partly destroyed cystomb of possibly Middle Helladic date was also found. Gray-Bernist constitutes the majority of the assemblage, with goblets being the most representative, a typical shape for Attica and central Greece. In the specific deposit, Gray-Bernist is strictly associated to fine fabric, with slight variations of colors presumably because of the atmosphere and temperatures reached during the initial firing. FG1A is hard and dark grey throughout, while FG1B is light grey, sometimes less hard with biscuit effect. In terms of the manufacturing process, related signs as those observed in the fine Gray-Bernist of Plassey suggest that the wheel was also used, combined in similar ways with coil building. Other varieties of Gray-Bernist and coarser fabrics more or less related to handmade techniques were not attested. Gray-Bernist with similar features has also been recognized in the rest of the Athenian Agora. However, the emerging pattern may not be necessarily representative for the entire Athens, not until the full publication of other assemblances. Thorikos is the third site to be discussed. As already said, the settlement mainly flourished during late Middle Helladic to early Late Helladic period. However, there are substantial indications that habitation might have started earlier, possibly from the beginning of Middle Helladic. The Gray-Bernist presented here comes from various assemblances, not necessarily stratified, and it is dated to Middle Helladic II and III according to the available parallels. The quantification attempted for its representation can only be based on the settlement deposits excavated by the Belgian school in mid and late 60s. Fine Gray-Bernist prevails, while a semi-coarse variety with schist inclusions and silver mica seems to constitute a small minority. However, both fabric groups are associated to similar wheel fashion techniques of manufacture as those encountered at Marathon and Athens. The relation of the less fine varieties of Gray-Bernist at Thorikos and Plassey warrants further investigation. Interestingly, fairly coarse to coarse Gray-Bernist is also attested at Elefsis, based on the recently published data, while in Kiafathiti, which is contemporaneous with Thorikos, Gray-Bernist is exclusively fine, as in the Athenian Agora. It may be assumed then that the production of semi-coarse Gray-Bernist, handmade or wheel fashion, is related to potting traditions shared between coastal sites, but this hypothesis definitely needs to be further investigated based on analytical methods and a detailed examination of more Attic sites. This short and preliminary overview of the available evidence underlined that any comparison made in the Gray-Bernist of two different regions can only be meaningful when substantial information is acquired for the entire technological sequence, including typology, the latter particularly linked to consumption practices and local preferences. Therefore, Gray-Bernist can no longer be examined from a modern point of view, which is in favor of Boeotia's hypothetical high standards. The examination of Gray-Bernist in Attica indicated that potter's wheel was highly involved in the manufacturing process. Handmade Gray-Bernist did exist, but its typological similarities with its wheel fashion counterpart indicate that they were also produced within a common cultural framework. In the Argolith, the situation is reversed. Gray-Minian is predominantly handmade, while the complex use of wheel was only observed in a small number of products. The apparent technological and typological affinities of the latter with central Greece's Gray-Bernist indicates that the specific pots were either imported or produced by potters who were familiar with the potting practices of a different cultural environment. At this point, it is interesting to stress that both areas witnessed an increase of Aeginetan wares from Middle Helladic I late to Middle Helladic II. Being visually distinct, Aeginetan pottery is generally a helpful indicator for tracing external contacts. It is thus possible that the appearance of wheel fashion products, at least in Argos, could be seen within a wider revitalization of the communication networks that enabled the transfer of products and/or people. This is, however, only a half-finished scenario, based on significant limitations that create certain obstacles and gaps. Being overlooked by research for many years because of the phenomenal poverty of the material culture, Middle Helladic period has not been systematically investigated. The development of pottery organized in conventional chronological phases has to be updated and refined, given the significant degree of regionality that obscures direct comparisons between synchronous events. To accomplish this, well-stratified deposits are of primary importance for the close examination of any technological sequence. Especially as far as the use of wheel is concerned, the investigation of the earliest Middle Helladic period is prerequisite to fully understand the formation processes of potting traditions after the end of the early Bronze Age. Thank you very much.